Good day and welcome to yet another important podcast and conversation. Thanks to the team at ILAF. My name is Borgit Osachane. And I always say this in these conversations, but I really am honored to have been invited by ILAF to host this important conversation. And this edition, we're talking about reconnecting with people through their languages and talking specifically within the context of politics. And I would also want to, in our conversation, extend it to the language used by government, as I feel the two are very much connected. Our guest for this conversation is political analyst, Professor Samadoda Fikeni. Prof, thank you very much for joining us in this important conversation. Thanks to the team at ILAF. It's good to connect with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me and to be part of this very important conversation. I congratulate ILAF for the work they are doing to promote the essence of our heritage, because indigenous language is the DNA of any culture, of any civilization, and of any heritage.
And I'm glad you mentioned that last point, Prof, because within the context of the topic itself, there are a number of questions that we need to ponder that speaks to whether or not the indigenous languages and cultures and heritages of our people are in any way honored, respected, or even acknowledged within the political and government context. There are a couple of questions that we are going to ponder on: why it is that so many politicians use English when communicating with voters, and whether or not there is a link between the use of indigenous languages and democracy. I think maybe where I could start, Prof, on a general level, ask the question around the history of language that is used in our country when it comes to politics and government in general. Are we able to trace back and look at the history of politics, or even the history of the anti-apartheid movement within the context of language and which language has been used?
Well, let me start by saying that the Dutch, who came in 1652, ordinarily promoted the Dutch as the language in the Cape. And when the British took over, they then imposed English as their language, because colonialists always knew that you can use an army to conquer people, but you can't sustain that. You have to dominate them culturally, psychologically, and otherwise. And that transmission is mainly through language. Even the missionaries coming in, that was the same introduction of English language. So it became a dominant factor. Later on, the Dutch and the other settlers who had come in early, some of them French Huguenots, some of them the free beggars and so forth, tried to reconstitute themselves to fight against the domination by the British and the English in particular. So that's when they started constructing Afrikaans. And Afrikaans had elements, of course, of localized, words. But in essence, it was a tool to counter the British hegemonic exercise of cultural power. And it is for that reason then, even when you had the Union of South Africa after the Anglo-Boer War, or what is called South African War sometimes, that English and Afrikaans coexisted, showing the balance of forces between the two. And when the apartheid regime came to power in 1948, Afrikaans was being pushed as they were trying to unply themselves from the English domination And when South Africa became a republic and therefore pushing away from being a British colony, so to speak, that they tried to use Afrikaans even in Namibia. It is for that reason then, one, that the discourse in the main was conducted in English, even education system and so forth. But then the reaction when Afrikaners tried to impose their own, for example, in the student riots of 1976, because of the forced use of Afrikaans. And that became a rallying point to say apartheid and Afrikaans became so closely conjoined as such. And the struggle to liberate people from the domination of these languages came in. But then we dropped the ball because as much as this cultural activism, trying to promote indigenous cultures, indigenous languages, the actors like Miriam Makeba, or the performing artists like Hugh Masekela and many others globally, and locally many, trying to struggle to preserve our cultures at the dawn of our independence in 1994. We seem to have dropped the ball because we forgot that power exists politically, economically, and socially or culturally. We tended to focus more on political power and to some extent economic power. But we forgot that there can be no hegemonic dominance without linguistic and cultural domination. Hence, today, we are a numeric majority, but a cultural minority, where the discourse is mainly conducted in English.
And staying with that, even preceding 1994, and I want to revisit what you just said about the ball that was dropped, Prof. But preceding even 1994, and looking at the anti-colonial movement or anti-apartheid movement, is it fair to say that even within that context, the fights that were had, the emergence of anti-apartheid movements, anti-colonialist movements, they in themselves fitted into or fell into the use of English as a medium of opposition?
That is true to a large extent for a number of reasons. The first one, there was a notion that you have this diversity of African languages. Which language would you use? And by default, English then was used. Much because the more modern educated elite had socialized across their linguistic and cultural differences by using English. For example, if they met at Fort Lovedale or any other colleges, Ohlange and so forth, Adams College, they would use English, and it was the medium of instruction. So it was then conducted in that space, but at the same time though, we should not underestimate the performing artists, the music groups, your Ladysmith Black Mambazo, your Miriam Makebas and so forth, who tried so hard to popularize African languages in their music, in their performance, in their artwork and so forth, as a weapon to fight against European domination, even the dress code and so forth. So there was a pushback and there was an appreciation that cultural activism and the use of language and the use of music in our indigenous languages could be a fight back. The doi songs in the main were in our indigenous languages and so forth. And even the church groups, as they were composing songs and so forth, independent churches and even those within the mainstream churches, the use of indigenous languages was quite embedded. But there is also an irony in this case. apartheid itself tried to reinforce, but for negative reasons, differentiation through strong promotion of cultures, where they were saying, we want you, if you are vendor, to be vendor because you are different. If you are closer, to be closer because you are different. And they call that separate development. And that in itself, to some degree, did actually help revive some of the cultures and the languages as they were trying to enforce them in order to divide. So this coincided with that use of our indigenous cultures for resistance. Black consciousness movement, Pan-Africanist movement were very strong in trying to emphasize in this countercultural hegemony by saying ours is to rediscover who we are as Africans, as indigenous people. So there are many threads to this, but the reality is that where the elite met, they conversed in the main in English. But where you had mass mobilization, like you saw during the mass defiance campaigns, like you saw during the Black consciousness movement campaigns in the 70s, or the mass democratic movement in the 80s, those communities and grassroots organizations use their indigenous languages as a weapon of resistance.
Oh, and you just reminded me of something, Prof, where I want to, must make a point so that I do not forget. I want to come back to the role played, or at least the experience, particularly from the organizations that you speak of, from the mass democratic movement, and how during the most recent local government elections, there's been this resurgence of community-based organizations and them being active participants in the elections, and their use of indigenous languages as part of their campaigning. But if we were to then firstly go to 1994, and coming back to the question of that link between the use of indigenous languages and democracy, you spoke of a ball that was dropped in 1994. And it makes me wonder if in 1994, with us going into a post-apartheid South Africa, the journey that South Africans were supposed to be taken on, the journey of democracy and what it meant, if we dropped the ball in 1994 to some extent, does that mean that a number of us as South Africans have not been taken on the journey of democracy in a post-apartheid South Africa because of not using indigenous languages?
That is actually correct. And it has had far-reaching implications. Let me give you a simple example. We once invited Ngugi wa Thiong'o when I was the president of the African Student Union at Michigan State University. And he did mention something, that he was invited to Germany into this very prestigious international languages, indigenous languages conference to give a keynote address. And he arrived there, he had prepared his keynote address, but he never told them how it was going to be presented. And he started reading it in Kikuyu for a good 40 minutes. And he could see they were sweating. They didn't know what was happening. There was no translator prepared and so forth. And in the end, he sat down and said he will welcome questions. And he said, this is how people in most democracies are hearing you people when you speak your languages, and they are not being involved. And this is the same situation that you have seen in our case, where much of the discourse about our democracy, about our commercial life, the economy, about health issues such as the pandemic now, is conducted in English and in a very technical language. And yet 90% of people who are likely to be most affected by these are the indigenous people, most of whom do not understand English. So there is not much effort to involve them at a close range. Same when we're discussing a whole range of issues of economic recovery, a whole range of issues, even when discussions about the inputs into the constitution and so forth, mainly in English and sometimes in Afrikaans. And as such, even a small medicine in any pharmacy, no matter how small the font is, you'll find it written in English and Afrikaans. Hardly ever in our indigenous languages, even things which are generally used by indigenous people is Zambak. Even his name, you have not seen one white person using his name, but all of them are written in English. And sometimes in workplaces, the danger signs and warnings about chemicals and so forth, they're in English. And yet the people who are working there are almost 100% indigenous people. So that's how alienated people have become from the body politic and national discourse. Then do we wonder when they stay away from elections increasingly? It's because we are increasingly experiencing legitimacy crisis of people who say, you are deciding things on our behalf, you're speaking above us, you're speaking about us, and perhaps they've reached a point to say nothing about us without us, which is the motto for the, disabled.
Yeah. It's quite puzzling then for me, Prof, that one would expect, or at least assume, that because of those who are in government, because of the history of their involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle, some of them having been cultural activists in the country and in exile, that there would be an understanding of the need to deal with what you referred to earlier on about numerical majority versus cultural minority, that these are things that at some point they spoke of, at some point they understood, and part of why there was even their involvement in the anti-apartheid struggle is to undo exactly that. But how does one drop the ball on something so important that supposedly you know of and you know the consequence of not rectifying?
There are several ways of answering your question. The first one is to talk about something and to believe intrinsically in something are two different things. How many people have talked of Marxism and went on to do the direct opposite? Which means we assumed that these leaders had internalized these concepts and had been deeply conscientized in them. Apparently, they were not. At the earliest enticement of power and the hegemonic power that was existing, they were very quick to say, we will assimilate to whatever was existing instead of transforming it. In fact, the deepest crisis that we're facing right now is the fact that those the masses entrusted to transform the system apparently didn't have the appetite and conviction to do so. They were merely happy to be assimilated. That's why you have the greatest inequality that you see. That's why you have people who have moved into gated communities. Many leaders, the social distance between them and the people has become so vast. So they merely are visitors and tourists among their people. And they quickly retreat back to the spaces they assimilated to. So to me, the original sin is the fact that we left everything to leadership. Each time in the history of this country where people have been mobilized to come into the center and they have played a role, the needle has moved in the direction of social justice. Each time it has been left to leadership, things have literally been just that leaders become weak themselves, even if they were well-meaning, if they alienate themselves from their base. By the time they confront the other side realizes that they are so alienated, therefore they are weak to even bargain with them. Let me give you examples. Before 1950s, the Youth League of the ANC protested the fact that the leaders were getting comfortable, they were becoming elitist, they were going for delegations to London again and again. They were not involving the masses. So they wanted mass participation. And indeed, once you had mass defiance campaigns, people participated in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions in their various communities because they were given a sense of agency. And they could participate locally, nationally, and otherwise. Hence, you could have the production of the Freedom Charter, you could have the treason trials of 1956, you saw women marching on the Union Building, you saw the PAC being born in 1959, and you saw this climaxing in confrontations which led to Sharpeville and so forth, and the new phase of our struggle because of the mass participation. In the 70s, Black consciousness movement emphasized again human agency rather than leadership agency. That's when you had many Black forums, Black Management Forum, Black Lawyers Association, liberation theologies, and so forth coming up. In the 80s, the mass democratic movement, again, masses participated, whether they were sports clubs, the churches, the whatnot, and so forth. But the moment you had a negotiated settlement where leaders, the elite from one side, the elite from the other side, they sat down, they agreed on things, and the masses retreated or were demobilized. That's where you see the disaster, because we never thought if you were in exile, if you were in MK, if you were in Robben Island, you could actually be involved in corruption. We assumed it wouldn't happen. We never thought that the liberators would actually have the moral bankruptcy at times to do things that we started seeing them doing. So all those things, it's when we assume that leaders, by saying things, they believe in them. And we then learned later that in politics, there are no permanent enemies, there are no permanent friends, there are permanent interests for the elite.
Yeah. And we're seeing that now, Prof, in the aftermath of the local government elections and what continues to be a challenge, at least in some metros. But in staying with our most recent election and tying it with what you mentioned around the role of social justice movements, I personally have, at least over the years leading up to the election, seen that resurgence of civil society groups and social justice movements, whether we're talking Section 27, equal education, and also, of course, the consistent work of Abahlali Basemjondolo as an example. And in the most recent election, tracking what has been happening, I've seen this emergence of a number of social justice movements and community-based organizations actively participating in the elections. But I'm wondering if even with their participation, are we at all seeing an increased use of indigenous languages in their campaigns or even in their espousing whatever policy positions that they do stand for?
Well, I do think that it's a promising sign that you do have these community-based movements. But with a bit of caution to say that some NGOs and pressure groups, interest groups, still mainly well-resourced, led by whites. Nothing wrong with that, but the participation level in terms of the strategizing, the leadership and so forth, you don't see an equitable participation. So the well-resourced, well-funded entities surely raising the right issues, but you don't see mass participation per se. So there's still a long road to go. But what you normally would see when you have community organizations is the greater use of the indigenous languages. More so because when it's local government elections, you could confine it into a certain area. But when we go back to national elections, you're beginning to see, again, the reverting back to English, because people say, no, I want to, transmit a message that other people will understand. The biggest problem here is that many people tend to shy away from using these indigenous languages or even code switching because they think the sign of unity is to speak English. Whereas you could switch from Sotho to Zulu or from Xhosa to Tswana and so forth and be generally understood, which we normally do in churches and elsewhere. But there's just this misnomer that for you to be heard clearly, it should be in English. And of course, the obsession of others to appear in the headlines in the next day's newspaper, because again, the media is mainly in English, whether it's your broadcast or your online or your print and so forth, vast majority of it is in English. So we are thoroughly colonized in a sense. And emphatically colonized because we think liberation is to talk about our constitutional values and the institutions of democracy and to talk about economic distribution. We hardly have an intelligent, deep probing, discourse on languages and culture. It just touches the surface. It shows that we dropped the ball and this is the missing link in our transformation. And it is the missing link which goes deeper. Some of the social ills we see today, the collapse of the African family, the collapse of communities, the collapse of the moral code, it's because people's culture has been ripped apart. It's because people's languages have been ripped apart. So the social ills then have come in to penetrate that space.
The question then is what is to be done, Prof? And I want to draw from two quotes linked to two references that you've made. You earlier on made reference to the role played by singers, artists, and you reminded me as you were saying that a quote by the late Hugh Masekela, where at some point he spoke about how he's concerned about the trajectory of Africans and what we're losing, and how one day they will ask a child, who are you? And the response would be, they say that we used to be African. And I want to link that also to, again, going back to Dade Gugi wa Thiong'o. I think he said something to the effect of language, any language has a dual character. It is both a means of communication and a carrier of culture. With what we have identified as a risk from Brahim Masekela, or even the importance of language when it comes to communication and culture, what is to be done? Can this situation be saved?
Any situation in human experience, history tells us that it can be saved. But for it to be saved, we should not be fooled by the fact that we have a beautiful constitution. We should not be fooled by the fact that we say we're now free. We should understand the turning around of the clock and elevation of our heritage and indigenous languages will take organization and should be understood as a new frontier for the struggle. Because the problem is that once you are told you are now free, people think that talking about these things in seminars and not fighting for them the same way we fought against apartheid, the same way we fought for several other things, the same struggles against slavery, the same struggles against colonialism and so forth, they ought to be conducted at different planes at this particular stage. The African indigenous intelligentsia should be at the heart of these struggles. The cultural activists should be at the heart of these struggles and try in the simplest possible way to explain to people why it is so very important to embrace your indigenous languages, because many people, including the very elite that you were saying we should look up to guide us away from this, they go to private schools, they pay these massive amounts of money so that their child can speak perfect English, and they find Afrikaans is also compulsory in those schools, even if they are not going to use it elsewhere, but it is compulsory. And they then brag and sort of say, my kids cannot speak their language. So what Huma Segela feared would in future happen is actually already happening. And this will also need a well-organized movement on the ground, grassroots, where we push back and we insist on the fight for indigenous languages. For example, a few years ago, we started ILIFA, which is more of the indigenous, languages initiative, and that ILIFA is for advocacy. We've been going to departments, we've gone to premiers, we've gone to different entities. For example, asking simple questions. If you have a national carrier like the South African Airways, why can't they even record indigenous languages and music so that people have a look and feel that they've arrived in an African soil, and greetings and safety things? Because you do not need to say so-and-so need to even know these languages per se on a given day. Let's say you have whites or Indians who are operating on that given day. Why can't you just, as you go to India, to China, to Ethiopia, everywhere else, they play their, languages. And even if it is pre-recorded, but with us, we don't.
Yeah.
Even when we have name changes that have been changed, they are misspelled because someone just Googles. They do not want to even give a cent to people who are speakers of those languages. There is an economic dimension to this.
Yeah.
So to us, we must begin to link the current social crisis that we're facing with the loss of the essence of who we are, our DNA, which is our heritage, which is our languages, and so forth. You can see right now that even with the COVID-19, people were beginning scrambling to find Mhlonyane and so forth. This is what we grew up doing, but we threw it away. Now it comes back packaged in some Woolworths and other expensive shops. And it tells you that when you abandon your heritage, you'll find it very expensive down the road. Then we were told this other myth, which has no scientific basis, that you must culturally disarm in order to modernize. And yet, the most advancing countries like China are not culturally disarming. They are modernizing within the prism of their own cultures. India, Japan, they are using their own indigenous languages, but we are the ones who are told first culturally disarm in order to understand robotics and coding and this and that. Fourth industrial revolution, which means we should announce our presence in our languages in your Google spaces in your YouTubes, in your different Wikipedias and so forth, so that even in those particular spaces, we are present. But the reprinting of some of our classic works in indigenous languages and promotion of them and creating films out of them or drama series will go a long way to promote these within the platform that is being used. And we must bring the youth into this space, because if it's elderly people like myself preaching, we will talk to the converted, and the youth will be busy in a corner doing Minecraft in English and going into all the different channels, escaping anything that looks like their mother tongue.
Very clear on what needs to be done, Prof, and really, really appreciated this conversation. I hope that ELAF provides us with another opportunity to connect once again and expand further on what we've discussed, but really appreciate you. Thank you very, very much for being part of this conversation.
Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.